Well, wherever we look around the world, we obviously see deep instability in the countries and everywhere, around the world. But I guess it's particularly the case, of course, in the Arab region. It's a deep crisis and deep instability. Lots of people are, of course, encountering poverty, unemployment, misery. And the masses are obviously also extremely angry about their own governments and their own regimes turning a complete blind eye to what's happening in Palestine. And there is this constant brewing of anger basically in society, and this feeling of detachment from their own governments and their own regimes, who are not only making situations only worse in their own countries, but again, also this whole connection that people feel with Palestine has been completely ignored by their own governments and politicians. Now, this detachment and this anger is obviously a base and a sort of a layer of laid down basically the conditions for revolution, for revolutionary potential at least. And I think that the Arab Spring shows us truly of what's possible. And what started as a spark in Tunisia led to a mass revolutionary movement, which toppled dictatorships that seemed like to be there, for forever, for decades. And in Tunisia, Ben Ali, after being the country's ruler for over 23 years, was overthrown in a matter of just 3 weeks. And in Egypt, the Mubarak, 29-year-long Mubarak dictatorship was also overthrown in a matter of just 18 days. And that was also a regime, and again, dictatorships that people felt like might never end. And so without any leadership, organization or program, the masses bravely faced these brutal apparatuses of those dictatorships, and hundreds and thousands of police officers and bureaucrats and soldiers, they managed to literally basically topple still over one dictatorship after another. And this opened up a whole new period, not just in the Middle East, not just in the Arab region, but the whole world was inspired by the events of the Arab Spring. And this cut across all cultural, national and religious barriers. And a revolution united, all of the oppressed layers across the world, and of course, especially in the Arab region, against their ruling class and against the imperialist masters. And of course, the revolution also therefore managed to do and accomplish a lot more than all of these petty bourgeois reformists and NGOs have basically tried to accomplish for decades. And so, although on the surface, and I would say this basically, that however, the revolution was obviously fantastic and it was amazing, it was so inspiring, but it also posed questions to working class leaderships that no one could actually answer. And therefore, I would say that although on the surface of things, everything changed, it's also equally true to say that actually fundamentally nothing had changed, because the old state apparatus remained completely intact. And the economy was and still is basically dominated by those masses that we thought were defeated. And so therefore it contains a lot of really important lessons for us to take today. Now, before the Arab Spring even took place, everyone had written off revolutions. Like the dictators that have been in power for decades, it seemed like a completely hopeless situation. And Tunisia, where it all began, was literally the last country that anyone looked at. It was the most, it seemed the most stable, and it was actually the most stable country in the Arab region. And there were literally no signs of anything. That is, of course, if you look at the surface of things, right? And when we actually look and penetrate deeper underneath the surface, what we see is that actually, in all of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, the majority of the population are young people, and they have only seen crisis and deep repression, because 70% of the youth under the age of the age of 25 in Tunisia are unemployed, and the figure's even higher in Egypt with 76%. And the university graduates, they would simply have no prospect of a job. And actually, especially in their culture, it's very important to have a job, because you are basically the main provider. And therefore you would not get a marriage, you would have no home, you would basically be stripped of no marriage, no home, no job, no nothing, and therefore no future. And they are motivated, therefore, by this deep sense of resentment towards the system that has deprived them of any future, from any normal, decent life. And on top of this, you also have the question of corruption and totalitarianism. Like, people were not allowed to gather. They weren't allowed to listen to music. They weren't allowed to party. They weren't allowed really to write. They weren't allowed to do anything. So this environment was completely suffocating. So of course, at some point, this will simply snap. And bourgeois commentators, they didn't see any of this. And of course, Trotsky commented and said that theory is foresight over astonishment. Now, this is precisely what we as Marxists and our organization had, but the bourgeois did not. And even when the masses went on the move, The Economist on the 6th of January 2011 wrote, "Tunisia's troubles are unlikely to unseat the 74-year-old president or even to jolt his autocracy." And when it spread eventually to Egypt, Hillary Clinton on the 25th of January 2011, commented, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable and is looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs of the Egyptian people." And then the BBC correspondent also commented and said, "Well, unlike Tunisia," this is about Egypt, "unlike Tunisia, the population has a much lower level of education. So therefore, they're simply too stupid. They're simply too ignorant to actually have a revolution. And they have a too low level of consciousness." So first, according to them, there can't be a revolution. Second, there can't be a revolution in Egypt. And third, there won't be any effect to any other countries. But you see, therefore, how ignorant they are, how they look at the masses with disdain and complete prejudice. But whether they liked it or not, the class struggle was being put back on the agenda, precisely because the similar conditions that were across the entire Arab region bruised similar actions being taken. And so it spread like wildfire. And now in the case of Tunisia, the movement started with an accident. And I use, of course, accident in a dialectical sense. Hegel said the necessity expresses itself through accident. And in this case, it was this young man, Mohammed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire purely out of desperation on the 17th of December in 2010. Now, there were, of course, many other cases like this, but this time it was different. The whole thing exploded. And there were other basically how I would see it is of course, the conditions have matured, right? Like a powder keg that was just simply waiting for the fuse. And the whole working class organized series of strike actions. They came out in mass numbers onto the streets. And of course, the first reaction of a regime is always the same. They use violence, they use repression. And that's basically what they did. And Ben Ali had a very big repressive apparatus. They used, and I would say the reformers, they always say this, right? They say, how could you have a revolution? Don't they have a big state? Don't they have the police and the army and all of the, institutions basically to crush it down, the police and all of this? And of course, yes, that's true. But the point is, once the masses go on the move, in that moment of truth, all of that is being swept to one side. And the police was very brutal in Tunisia. They used torches. They had snipers on rooftops, shooting at protesters. But the people fought back, and they didn't have any guns. They used their bare hands. And actually, one of the main slogans or chants that they would say was, "We do not fear you anymore. We have no fear." And that was precisely it's because of the massive number and liberation of being out there in those on the streets. And Marx, commented and said that sometimes a revolution needs the whip of counter-revolution. And that was precisely what happened in Tunisia and also later on in Egypt. And so the workers started to organize themselves. They had general strikes. They set up committees. And in reality, what you had was a situation of dual power that started to emerge. So then, of course, Ben Ali resorted towards concessions as he was left with nothing. And he tried a few concessions, he made a few speeches, and he said one of his final concessions or last concession was quite amusing, where he said, "I've ordered the army not to shoot anymore." And it was very easy to order something that was already taking place because the army and the people were starting to fraternize. And actually, the rank and file soldiers were very much in favor of what the revolution was offering them. And so, therefore, one bloody incident where an army would shoot one more unarmed demonstrator and the whole army would break into pieces. And so, therefore, Ben Ali didn't use the army precisely because he could not use the army anymore. And so on the 14th of January, that's 1 week after The Economist said that he couldn't be overthrown, he packed up his bags and he left to Saudi Arabia. And this obviously was a huge euphoria. People were celebrating onto the streets. It was a massive, massive gain and a win. And it had an enormous domino effect. After this, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain, it even reached into Israel, were all inspired and took on their own regimes and toppled them over. But I would say like one particular country that I'd like to focus on is Egypt. Because of course, once the Tunisians have shown the way, there was no turning back. And in Egypt, particularly, is a very important country. It's a strategic country in the Arab region. It has the largest Arab speaking population, has the largest working class, and is very much like the center of cultural activities. And Egypt also led this project of the Pan-Arabanism project led by Nasser in the mid-20th century. And so many people and many countries basically look towards Egypt as a guidance, essentially. And what's important to say, though, is that this revolution in Egypt didn't also come out of nowhere. Yes, obviously they were inspired by the events in Tunisia. But if you look at the years before, I would say that there was sort of an awakening of the working class in Egypt already taking place. One significant, really important strike that took place was on the 6th of April in 2008, where there was a mass strike in the industrial city of Mahala, which has over 25,000 workers, and they all work in this biggest textile factory in the whole of Africa. And it took on an insurrectionary character, where famously, again, it was led by women. 3,000 garment women came out, going on strike. And they would actually shame the man into action. They would shout on the streets as well, where are the men, here are the women. And they would bring all the men into action as well. And it evolved into a mass protest. And this movement also grew into wildcat sit-ins, and even an organization, the 6th of April movement, sprung out of that, basically. But it's very important also to note that this all took place outside of the regime-controlled Egyptian Trade Union Federation, which, of course, as you can imagine, is quite repressive, and they were trying to actually suppress any of those strike actions taking place, because there were 2,100 basically incidents or strikes and protests taking place between 2007 and 2010, but all of them outside of the regime-controlled trade union. And so once they tried to suppress those strike actions, actually you saw mass resignations outside of that trade union, and new independent unions were starting to establish itself. For example, there was a union even amongst tax collectors and amongst teachers, of course, but it was basically a sign of what is to come, because actually a lot of those independent strikes were illegal, so they were already going into that direction. And what's also really important to understand about Egypt, and of course across the Arab region, is this question of the state. Because it's clear, I guess, what the role is of the state. I guess in normal times, it presents himself as an unbiased thing that sort of serves people, is here for justice and keeps things calm and all that. But of course, during revolutions, the mask falls off, and it's the people learn through brutal ways and harsh lessons what truly actually is the role of the state, which is, of course, an organization of armed bodies of men who serve the interest of protecting private property and in defense of the status quo. All they're after is to keep the existing order intact. So therefore, even if you remove leaders, even if you remove dictators, the state will continue to play a reactionary role to keep the existing order intact. But in Egypt, you had quite a peculiar case, in the sense that it was quite complicated, because the SCAF, known as the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, so the army basically, there were real illusions in the SCAF. And this all dates back to the time of Nasser, because in that time, the army was perceived as the great defender of society. And this is because Nasser was obviously this anti-imperialist figure, and therefore the army kind of played this anti-imperialist role. So, however, the composition of the army in Egypt is actually, a bit complicated, because the army tops and the big generals, they are actually part of the capitalist class because they own 20% of the Egyptian economy. Because the generals and the big generals, basically, they have their own factories and firms. And so whenever like people would get confiscated to the army, they often end up working in those factories or in those firms. And so you had a real sort of class struggle taking place within the army. So you can also imagine how a rank and file soldier is looking again quite favorably towards the revolution and sees like his own interest in the revolution as well. So when the revolution started in Egypt on the 25th of January, it was on the Day of Rage, as it was called, basically. Now, this date is not an accident. The organizers have chosen this to fall on the same day as a police holiday, which was basically a day to celebrate the police in Egypt. But of course, there was so much police brutality and so much anger about the police that they wanted to make a statement, like we have nothing to celebrate here. And so they have called for that day to be the Day of Rage. And over 100,000 people, again inspired by Tunisia and all that, they got onto the streets, and they correctly started by occupying Tahrir Square. But this actually developed in the next few days from 100,000 to 2 million, on top of 2 million people at the same time on this square occupying it. And then so then, of course, like the next thing that Mubarak will do, again, like Ben Ali, was to repress, right? To send in tanks, send in army, trying to crush it. But you saw this really interesting thing where people started to surround the tanks, and the soldiers would like come out of the tanks, and they would be handed by the protesters the Egyptian flag, and they would take it on and wave it. And then people would jump on the tanks and hug soldiers. And it was like a complete, a very powerful image of how quickly basically the fraternization was taking place. And Lenin remarked, right, that revolutions are basically the festivals of the oppressed. And that was so much the mood in Tunisia and in Egypt especially. Because the Arab nations, they were once great nations, and they have been enslaved and humiliated by imperialists for over 100 years. And Mubarak and Ben Ali were complete stooges, to US imperialism, to Israel. They've completely betrayed the Palestinian cause. So there's a real deep hatred against imperialism. And so also the slogans of the revolution was also kind of centering around dignity. Like one of the quotes was, or the slogan is, bread, freedom, and dignity. And also the people want the fall of the regime. But, in a revolution like a strike, anyone who has been downtrodden before, who basically didn't really do anything or didn't think that they were anything, that consciousness starts to turn into its opposite. And that's basically what happened, because the psychological question is so important. This is not just a question about wage increases or anything. This is about ordinary workers feeling something special, feeling something clicking in their mind, where they state, I am actually a human being. I want to live a normal life. I want to live a dignified life. I want to be treated with respect. I want to have my rights. That is such an important part of the revolution. But you had people who looked at this and said, oh, but that's not a real revolution then. This is just a bourgeois revolution, because they don't bring forward immediate socialist demands. And they basically do not understand this. They don't understand how incredibly progressive this actually was. The imperialists, they have also tried to basically use the Islamists, as a way to sort of boogeyman, to confuse the masses and to conceal, the real nature of the Arab Revolution. And they say, look, if Mubarak goes, Al-Qaeda will take its place. And Mubarak himself also said, you don't want this to be like Iraq, do you? You have to stop. And these were all complete lies. The role of the fundamentalists and organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which I will also come on to later, their role has been completely exaggerated. They had actually no role in the revolution. And they posed themselves obviously as anti-imperialists, but they had no interest in a last analysis, to actually do anything. They would, of course, betray the workers and the peasants. However, the point is, we cannot ourselves expect a pure revolution. We cannot expect a perfect revolution. And that's also Lenin who commented on that. He said, like, whoever expects to see a pure socialist revolution will never live to see one. And that's precisely what was the case here. In the first instance, the demands of the revolution are obviously, it's just upside down here, no, that's fine, are obviously like to fulfill, the real democratic needs of the people. Of course they want, democracy. Of course they want freedom. They've been enslaved or downtrodden by dictatorships for 30 years. Of course that's going to be their longing, for freedom. But naturally their desire for democracy can therefore be abused by bourgeois politicians who are only looking after their careers eventually in this democratic parliament. But communist and working class leaders, they're obliged to take up their democratic demands and to give them a sharply revolutionary contact that can fundamentally change society. And of course, connecting it, the task of overthrowing Mubarak to a complete sweep of everyone who's been in the old regime and connected to the old regime, and the seizure of property, of their hangers on, of the generals and the imperialists, of course, who backed them. And so this is also important whenever people say that, workers cannot run society for themselves, right? Because obviously by looking at the Arab Spring itself, and especially in Tahrir Square, is the biggest expression of actually how well workers can organize themselves and completely run society by themselves. It was amazing, microscopic sort of, expression of how this would look like. Because once the occupied square was occupied, like Tahrir Square, and it had over 2 million people at one time, it was completely spotless. It was actually, unlike the other streets, it was covered in dirt. This was a complete, expression of how much care they took of it. Mobile clinics were set up by doctors and nurses who joined the revolution. Food and other supplies were distributed to everyone, and areas were even set up for film screenings, stages were set up for impromptu concerts, music was being played, political discussions were being held. And also after the security forces were being defeated, they left the streets. So revolutionaries installed their own checkpoints at Tahrir Square to ensure everyone's safety. And they had shift rotations, but also outside of the square, by the way, in all sorts of neighborhoods. They had all sorts of committees being set up to also ensure the safety of apartment buildings against regime hired thugs trying to come in, or security forces or anything like that. But also, let's take a moment and look at the role that women played. Because women in the Egyptian society were extremely oppressed. They weren't even allowed often to leave the house, only maybe to go to work. And they were, of course, often very much harassed and therefore I would say, in many ways, it was so remarkable that at least 50% of the people there were women on Tahrir Square. And women were integral to the success of the revolution, because without them feeling empowered, an equal part of the street demonstrations and of course of the strike movements, there would not have been a revolution. And men also learned this, in experience of fighting alongside women, how important their role is in ensuring their success. And in fact, they treated, of course, they managed to understand, how to treat them equally, but also more than that, for the sake, of course, for the revolution to succeed, they needed them there. So anyone in Tahrir Square who would even dare to harass a woman, they would be spray painted to publicly shame them and say, you're trying to undermine what we're trying to do here. Basically, you're not ensuring their safety. And they would be harassed and basically removed out of Tahrir Square. But of course, it's also important to note that, as soon as the revolution receded or basically fell, of course, the ones that were at the forefront of the revolution are also hit the hardest, right? And that's, of course, also what happened, where women were thrown back basically into the household and stuff, and come down very hard on this revolutionary layer. But yeah, Mubarak really tested the Egyptian masses, because he still refused to leave. And so on the 6th of February 2011, whilst he was clinging on to power, the workers started to organize themselves and actually conducted then general strikes across Egypt, hitting every sector and hitting also really important strategic sectors. And the main reason Mubarak had to go was obviously because the masses came out and started to organize these general strikes. Because of course, Tahrir Square with 2 million people is really impressive, but it doesn't hit where it really hurts. And that's obviously the economy and the running of the economy. So especially when the Suez Canal was hit with 6,000 canal workers they went on strike. They also stormed to other canal workers who still refused to go on strike and stormed them and tried to basically win them over to go and shut it down. And if they succeeded, it would have meant that at least 80% of the world oil transport would be stopped, which would of course be a huge devastating effect onto the world economy. So even the imperialists who for 30 and 40 years tried to establish a strong position, in those countries and in that region, they literally couldn't do anything. They realized that all of the work that they have done is basically being swept away in front of their eyes. And it shows how important and how significant the role is of the working class. And it's also for this reason then that the army then started to decide and saw the necessity to turn against Mubarak. And basically, not because, of course, of the revolutionary spirit of the SCAF and the army tops, but because they simply had no other option. If they had openly gone against the revolution, the military high command would probably have lost control over the army. And at best, they would have probably faced a civil war that is not even ensured that they would win. So they had to decide basically to put themselves at the head of the revolution in order to derail it, essentially, in order to prevent the complete dissolution of the state. And so on the 9th of February, Mubarak was gone. And this obviously was a major victory. You can imagine the huge euphoria, a dictatorship that anyone never thought would end, was finally closed, and people were out celebrating, through the night. But the masses, taking on their first steps onto the scene of history, did not actually have a clear plan of what to do once this dictatorship was gone. And in fact, on a number of occasions, especially in the last week before Mubarak had resigned, power was literally in the streets, just waiting for someone to grab them. But no working class leadership was doing it. And even the existing leaderships were refusing to. And thus power ended up basically in the hands of the army, of the SCAF, who supported, of course, US imperialism, were connected to them, and stepped in to avert the overthrow of Egyptian capitalism. And so all of the illusions that people then had in the SCAF were basically starting to evaporate. And the army passed on laws to prohibit strikes. They arrested protesters. At least 12,000 people were being put in prison. And of course, this serves again to underline how you may remove the head of a regime, basically, but the body was still completely intact. And then elections were held in November. And Morsi, who is the candidate for the Muslim Brotherhood, he stood against the candidate of the regime, which obviously helped to concentrate the vote basically around him. And he won then the majority with 24%. Although I would say it's not a true majority, as at least 46% of the eligible voters actually went to the polls. So the majority of Egyptians didn't even vote in those elections. And in most cases, they actually said that they voted also for Morsi because he was simply the lesser evil in the parliament. However, I would say there was actually a left-wing candidate, like a Nasserite, basically, who managed to get 20% of the vote, which actually shows that there was a real potential there. But the Muslim Brotherhood was the most organized force that was actually present in Egypt. And therefore, in the absence of a strong revolutionary party, it was basically likely to go into that direction. However, we can obviously not underplay also the role of religion, right? Because the Muslim Brotherhood used that to say, we care about the poor, we care about, the conditions of people. And Islam, of course, teaches us that. And so they were playing into this as well. And they would do a lot of actually charity work. They would do a lot of work amongst the poor. So you can see how, the idea that, you know, they would be different, they would care about poor people, they would care about the real same message, I guess, of Islam, you know, and try to gain votes and support on that basis. But the leaders of the Brotherhood were basically very skilled in deception, and took great care, you know, to hide their real material interest that lay behind their rhetoric. And they have been actually receiving a lot of funding from large layers of businessmen and prepped and backed, you know, by Western imperialism for years. And so the masses, they had illusions in the Muslim Brotherhood as actually the only sort of opposition movement that was also allowed to operate under Mubarak. But when the Muslim Brotherhood assumed control, it formed immediately alliances with the military council and used the police against the protesters. And so the people quickly realized, you're not any different. You're not any different from the army council and the military council or Mubarak. And so Morsi's regime was actually even more repressive and removed any of the remaining reforms from the time of Nasser, as they only defended their interests, as they were also a junior wing of the ruling class, the leaderships of Mubarak, of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this in turn led to a second revolution in Egypt of 2013, where there was this highest level of participation in class struggle that Egypt has ever seen, with 32 million people out. That's 1/3 of the Egyptian population came out onto the street. It was the biggest protest in Egyptian history, or even maybe of all of history. There was an immense amounts of participation. And so the military was, again, they were forced to remove Morsi and finally put down any pro-Morsi protest. And they again masked that under the idea of like, we're doing what the people want, you know, what the masses want. But actually what they're trying to do, obviously, was trying to stabilize the situation. They were trying to avert an openly revolutionary movement that could not just remove Morsi, but the entirety of Egyptian capitalism. And so al-Sisi, who was basically the commander-in-chief of the army, he then basically took over power and to try to stabilize the situation. And so this is the true tragedy, basically, of the Egyptian revolution as well, and of the Arab Spring. How massive the movement was, how much strength the working class and heroism they have shown, but clearly was not able to take us to its logical conclusion. And the experience of the Arab Spring also proves how basic bourgeois democratic tasks can simply not be fulfilled on the basis of capitalism. But more than that, we ended up in the situation right now, today, where conditions in the Arab world are thrown back even further, where capitalism and all of its crises and issues have been more and more aggravating with the years because of the lack of leadership that was willing to take this to its logical conclusion. And I think it's worthwhile, actually, to compare this basically to the events of the Russian Revolution. Because essentially what we saw with the overthrow of the dictatorships, I would say, was similar to the February Revolution. And it went through basically a similar trend where the masses in Russia, they overthrew the Tsarist regime, you know, in February. They also set up Soviets and worker committees all across the country. And essentially they had power in their hands, right? But they also handed it over to the provisional government. And the Russian Revolution is also the best example of how democratic demands like peace, land, and bread, in theory, could be achieved under capitalism, right? But in practice, they could not. Like, they had to be, or they could only be achieved by actually breaking with the bourgeoisie and by power passing to the working class. And so if it wasn't for the Bolsheviks patiently explaining this, patiently explaining their program, and basically also raising the slogan of all power to the Soviets, that they managed to lead the way, you know, to the overthrow of capitalism in Russia by October 1917. And so in Tunisia and Egypt, you had the most amazing opportunity after the days of the overthrow of Ben Ali and Mubarak. But you had, workers' committees popping up everywhere. The workers obviously on strikes, and they were completely, close essentially to taking power. As I said, there was a situation of dual power in Egypt and in Tunisia. However, where was an organization like the Bolsheviks that could explain this, that could connect to the people? And that is the main thing that was lacking, because the so-called Workers' Communist Party in Tunisia, they called for a congress for all of those committees to assemble, which is a good idea. But then what did they do? They didn't do anything with it. They had no practical steps, no real discussion. So nothing came out of this Congress. And in Egypt, it was even worse, where the leadership openly said, we have no political ambitions. And they simply spoke just about holding their own regime and their own government accountable. And that was it. And the Revolutionary Socialists, which is a group linked to the British SWP, they disgracefully supported Morsi in 2012 in the presidential elections, for which Morsi personally thanked them for. And in turn, you have basically, therefore, this such a closeness to taking power, but no one forming an actual threat to this. And therefore, the regime, it was given basically an open field for the regime to strike back. And that's exactly what happened. And so the masses felt power in their hands, but completely slipped away from them. But now, if you look on today, right, the conditions are everywhere ripe for revolution. The leaderships are or the regimes and the governments are completely detached from the masses. And the economy is only getting worse in Tunisia, for example, half of the youth, again, is unemployed, poverty is on the rise. And there's a huge migration crisis in Tunisia, where Tunisians are trying to make it into Europe to at least have some sort of decent life. And in Egypt, al-Sisi, again, completely unpopular and hated. And also pro-Palestine protests in Egypt and across the Arab region are completely suppressed and pressed. Protesters are literally being arrested or detained and harassed. So there's no expression of this growing anger. What is going on? Are we not supposed to be, for Palestinian liberation? That hatred and confusion is very stark in those countries. And again, you saw workers starting to take up their struggle again. The Mahala workers went on strike this year again in February. And not only had none of the issues been solved, but I would say, again, they've been severely aggravated. And the root cause of all of this is, of course, capitalism and a system that is in deep crisis and is unable to give even the smallest concession to the masses. But what's going to happen, for example, if there was an Egyptian revolution, it's not ruled out, but I would say there are many pitfalls. And therefore, it's more important than ever for us to understand our task and for us to understand how to avoid basically those pitfalls. Because it's then on that basis, by good understanding of those questions, that we can build a party that can lead the masses onto a success, right? That can build an alternative, not just, in Europe, but also in the Middle East and throughout the world. And that's what we have to do by also doing it patiently, explaining patiently our ideas, and win over the ones and twos and, of course, the tens and hundreds into our ranks. But we have also heard, I would say, a lot of the times that Arabs are simply conservative, fundamentalist, Islamist. Why would they care about communism? And I would say that's completely wrong. If you look at the traditions of the Arab world, it is communist. And Egypt, the Nasserite movement, Nasser obviously had his problems, but people were looking at him favorably for nationalizing really important key sectors in the economy and raise living standards. And of course, those ideas can basically be revived and come back, to create, say, a pan-Arabic state and things like this. And in Syria, the Communist Party was huge. In Iraq, the Communist Party had millions and millions of members as well. In Sudan, millions of members. Actually, the Iranian communist movement was the biggest communist movement in the whole of the developing world. And the point is, all of this could be revived. And why? Precisely because reality pushes the masses into understanding, basically, pushes the masses into that direction of that. The problem is that capitalism can simply not be reformed, right? The point is that reality makes clear that capitalism has to go and has to be broken away with. And that's what you see globally, because how on earth are we supposed to reform our way out of this deep crisis, out of the war and poverty and misery globally? How are we supposed to do that? There is simply no way. So in light of all these things, I would say that we should be happy that we are living in this period where the future of humanity is going to be decided. And the point is that we can be part of that decision. You all can be part of that decision. And of course, it's not going to be an easy road. But at the same time, I would also say that it has never been easier, because the youth are looking more and more towards communism, towards socialism. And of course, by explaining those lessons and those events and the way forward, can we actually build an organization that is able to bring all of the horrors of capitalism to an end? Because yes, we say we have a world to win, but winning has never been achieved by luck alone. And we cannot leave it up to chance alone. We have to actually prepare and build and train ourselves for that victory. And that's our task for us today, to prevent any of such strategies anymore and not take them for granted, these lessons, but study them carefully to build the most powerful, decisive party that we have ever seen. So thank you.
Thanks for listening, comrades. If you want to learn more about this topic, then follow the links in the episode description. As Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. But it's not enough to just study the ideas of Marxism. You need to get organised in a force that's capable of connecting those to the living struggle. So if you're listening to this podcast and you agree with the ideas, but you're not yet a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, then go to communist.red/join and help us in the fight for revolution.